What time is it where you are? And where are you listening from tonight? If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into forgotten history, feel free to subscribe. There's more waiting for you in the quiet. Now let's begin. It is early morning, in a frost-covered courtyard. A pale pink sky stretches over the grey stone of a castle nestled deep in the hills of 13th century France. The air is quiet, almost too quiet, like it's holding its breath. Somewhere inside the cold stone walls, a royal woman is being prepared. She does not dress herself. That is not her role. A servant carefully lifts a stiff linen chemise from the warm stones near the fire and slips it gently over her shoulders. The cloth is rough, but she does not wince. She is used to it. She was taught not to flinch from discomfort, just as she was taught not to cry too loudly during childbirth. Her name is forgotten now. Her face does not live on in paintings, nor do her words in books. But she was real. And like so many royal women of her time, her life was a careful act of survival, played out beneath layers of velvet, protocol, and silence. Being born royal in the medieval world was not always a gift, especially for women. Royal women were not princesses in towers or queens on thrones, not in the way we often imagine. They were symbols, pawns, vessels for lineage. Their lives were charted from birth to be of use to others, to kingdoms, to bloodlines, to husbands they had not yet met, and it all began with their bodies. From the moment a royal daughter was born, her worth was measured in how well she might be married off. Before she could speak, ambassadors were already making inquiries. Who would she be promised to? Which duke, which king, which aging widower seeking a younger bride to bear him sons? Her name was spoken in council halls long before she understood what it meant. She was raised in a world of rules. Speak softly, do not laugh too loud, walk slowly, sit straight. Learn to embroider, but not just for leisure. Embroidery was seen as a moral discipline, a way to teach patience and obedience. Learn Latin so you can read scripture and be useful in court. Learn to ride side saddle, but never to gallop too freely. Every movement was watched. Every word was weighed. At 10 years old, she might be sent away from her family to live in another noble household. This was common. It was considered good practice. To teach her the manners and customs of the court she would one day marry into. She would sleep in a chamber with unfamiliar tapestries, eat strange food, and learn the unspoken etiquette of a foreign court. There was little warmth, little privacy. She may have a wet nurse, a governess, a maid. But these women were not mothers. They were assigned to her, and they too had their roles to play. No one in her orbit was allowed to be just human. Everyone wore a mask of duty. When she reached her 12th or 13th year, the conversations around her changed tone. No longer a child, she was now a woman in the eyes of the court. Her body was examined quietly, by noble women and midwives alike. Was she developing properly? Was she strong enough to bear children? Was she fertile-looking? These were the questions whispered in corridors. She might be married by 14, sometimes younger. The wedding ceremony would be grand, of course, a royal affair. But the girl, beneath the veil, was often terrified. She did not know this man. He might be twice her age. He might be cruel. But it did not matter. She would smile, bow her head, and thank her father for this honor. That is what she had been taught to do. The wedding night was not a private affair. In some courts, it was a public ritual. The couple might be escorted to the bedchamber by guests. The bed itself might be blessed by priests, and in certain traditions witnesses would remain just outside the door to ensure the marriage was consummated. Sheets were checked for blood the next morning. Virginity was not just a personal matter, it was political proof. Once married, her role narrowed even further. She was to bear sons. That was her duty. If she bore daughters, she was pitied. If she bore no children at all, she was scorned, sometimes set aside or replaced. A queen who could not produce an heir was considered defective, even cursed. She might be accused of witchcraft or suspected of hidden sins. People whispered, people watched. Pregnancy was a brutal ordeal in the medieval world. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, no clean surgical tools. Childbirth could take days. A woman might be surrounded by midwives chanting prayers, burning herbs, tying amulets to her wrists to ward off death. And yet, so many died anyway. A stillborn child was not uncommon. Neither was the death of the mother from bleeding, fever, or exhaustion. And if she survived, she was expected to return to her duties with dignity and silence. Royal women rarely grieved in public. They were expected to smile through funerals, to continue court appearances, to be presentable, composed, decorative. Grief was a luxury not often afforded to them. They were queens, duchesses, consorts. Their faces were painted on coins, but their voices were rarely recorded. If they tried to exercise real power, if they advised their husbands or questioned the court or ruled in their stead, they were often met with suspicion. A woman with political will was dangerous, unnatural, ambitious. Some navigated it well. They learned to wield influence from the shadows, through carefully chosen allies, quiet conversations, and patronage of scholars or artists. But others paid dearly for stepping out of line. Isabella of France was called the she-wolf. Margaret of Anjou was blamed for the wars of her husband. Eleanor of Aquitaine was imprisoned by her own king for too much independence. To be royal and female in medieval times was to live in a gilded cage. You wore fine gowns, yes, but they were tight, heavy, ceremonial, and made of fabric that bruised the skin. You lived in castles, yes, but those castles were cold, dark, and crawling with disease. You were praised for beauty, yes, but also reduced to it. You were surrounded by people, but often utterly alone. The life of a royal woman was not made of ballrooms and tiaras. It was made of rituals and restraints. Every joy had a condition. Every privilege came with a price. And in the silence of the stone chamber, beneath the velvet, behind the smiles, there lived a quiet truth. She was not free, not in the way we understand freedom now. Her path was drawn before her birth. Her value was in how well she obeyed it. And if she dared to want more than marriage, more than motherhood, more than smiling in paintings, then she had to keep it hidden, buried beneath silk and protocol and centuries of forgetting. She might have written poetry in secret, or learned to read the stars, or kept a diary in the margins of her prayer book. But history rarely kept those pages. It remembered only the men, the wars, the heirs. The rest was dust. And yet, her life mattered, even if it was quiet, even if it was hard, even if no one wrote her name in the book. She was there, and in the next part, we'll walk beside her again. The heavy stone walls echo faintly with morning birdsong. But inside the halls are cold, the kind of cold that creeps into the joints, settles behind the ribs, and lingers long after the fire has been lit. In one of the upper chambers of a royal castle, far from the bustle of the kitchens or the clamour of the courtyard, a queen sits alone. She is not old, but she feels older than her years. The weight of her title presses down on her even more than the jewelled circlet on her head. She was once a daughter, then a bride, now a queen. But what does that word really mean? A queen in the medieval world. was a complex thing. She was visible but voiceless, celebrated but scrutinized. She walked ahead of the court in processions, dressed in embroidered silks and edged with fur, yet she walked a careful line at every step. She was to be devout, obedient, fruitful, and beautiful, but not too powerful. She could advise the king, but only behind closed doors. She could lead a court of ladies, but not raise her voice in council. She could rule, but only in his absence and never with too much confidence. One wrong glance, one rumor, one misunderstood letter, and she might find herself accused of sorcery or treason or worse, impropriety. Royal women learned early how to wield silence like a blade, how to speak in gesture and glance, to deliver warnings and wisdom through embroidery patterns or the placement of a goblet at a feast. Theirs was not the power of armies, but the power of knowing who was watching, and more importantly, who wasn't. In many courts, queens were expected to oversee the moral behavior of the realm. She would sponsor churches, guide young ladies in chastity, and lead feast day rituals with holy decorum. But these tasks were not soft. They were demanding, relentless, and watched with the eyes of 1,000 clerics and courtiers. The queen must never show weakness, not in public. Behind her smile might be the grief of a lost child or the ache of a husband's betrayal. Many kings kept mistresses. Some did not hide it. Some fathered children outside the royal marriage and paraded them with twisted pride. And still, she was expected to stand beside him, offer him her hand, laugh when the courtiers laughed, to tea. Resist was to offend the throne itself. Some queens found a way to endure it, others crumbled in quiet. Still others turned to the church. It was common for royal women, especially widows, to retreat into religious life, not always out of piety, but out of exhaustion. A convent could offer sanctuary from courtly games. A cell with stone walls and cold bread could feel like freedom after decades of pretending. For others, escape came only in death. Records from the 12th and 13th centuries are filled with entries that speak in euphemism. A queen took ill after childbirth. A princess died in her chambers shortly after marriage. But behind these lines were long stories of infection, loneliness, and despair. Bodies gave out not just from plague or fever, but from years of being pushed past endurance. And yet, there were moments of strange beauty too. A queen might walk alone in the early dawn mist, watching the gardens bloom just beyond the stone archways. She might teach her daughter to read by candlelight, tracing soft fingers along the Latin verses etched in old vellum. She might find peace in the rhythm of a spinning wheel, or in the laughter of a maid whispering stories from the village. In the quiet away from the throne, she might remember who she had once been. Royal women lived in two worlds. In one they were symbols, crowned, cloaked, guarded. In the other they were simply women, breathing, aching, hoping. They knew what it meant to sit still for hours while a painter tried to capture a smile they did not feel. They knew what it meant to receive a letter from a sister across the sea, and read it 100 times because it was the only honest voice they'd heard in months. They knew the strange terror of having their meals tasted by another before they could eat. Poison was not a myth in medieval courts. A meal could be fatal. A sip of wine could end a dynasty. Even in luxury they were never safe. Their beds were high, surrounded by velvet curtains, but they were also traps, places where rumors began, airs were made, and secrets were whispered. Their jewels were valuable, but heavy. Some necklaces left bruises. Some crowns caused headaches. Their gowns were stitched with gold thread and stiffened with whalebone, so tight they could barely breathe during feast days. And still they smiled, still they curtsied, still they prayed. They prayed for their children, for peace, for deliverance. Sometimes they prayed for death, but death too was not simple. When a royal woman died, the rituals began immediately. Her body might be washed by veiled nuns, her limbs wrapped in embroidered linen. Her hair, so often braided and pinned during life, might be let down for the first time in decades. Her crown would be placed gently beside her. Not on her head, for she no longer ruled. In death she returned to silence. She might be buried in a cathedral, her tomb etched with words she never spoke, her name aligned beside her husband's. Sometimes her face was carved in stone, eyes closed, hands clasped in eternal devotion. But beneath the marble, she was gone, and the court would move on. Another queen would come. The throne did not wait for mourning. The lives of royal women were marked by such cycles. One queen replaces another. One princess becomes the bride. One mother's bloodline is secured by the birth of a son, while another fades from favor. These were not fairy tales. They were rotations of duty. And yet there is something powerful in remembering them, not as statues, not as decorations, but as people, as women who endured brutal births and political betrayals, as sisters who clutched hands during coronations and whispered fears in the darkness, as lovers, perhaps, whose feelings were never written in the books, as mothers who buried children without tears because tears were not allowed, as thinkers who read Cicero in secret, as artists who sang lullabies into stone chambers long after the servants had gone to bed. In the shadowed corners of royal life, beneath the silks and titles and careful bows, there lived real people. Women who laughed, ached, hoped, and carried burdens we'll never fully know. In the next part we will walk with one such woman, a bride sent far from home across the sea into a foreign land where no one spoke her tongue, a royal offering. A political gift, a girl who became a queen and then a prisoner. It was still dark when she arrived. The fog on the sea had not yet lifted, and the ship rocked gently in the narrow harbor. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, not the deep, clear tone of a cathedral bell, but a shrill warning from the guard. Towers above the dock. She was only 15, wrapped tightly in a woolen cloak far too heavy for her small frame. She stood at the edge of the gangplank and stared toward a castle that would never feel like home. The journey had taken weeks, through storms and high waves, through seasickness and whispers in a language she did not understand. She had left behind her mother's final embrace, the scent of rosemary in her old chamber, the quiet songs of the kitchen maids. All that was gone now. She had been given away. This was how kingdoms made peace in the medieval world, through women. Not through battle, not through treaties, not with handshakes or signatures, but with daughters. Royal women were the soft currency of diplomacy. Their bodies were the bridges, their wombs the promise of unity. And so when the king across the sea demanded a bride, her name was selected, not because she was loved or known or even old enough to understand, but because her father owed a favor, and her bloodline was clean. She had been betrothed at 9, and now 6 years later she was to be married. The wedding took place in the old cathedral, its spires stretching like fingers into the clouds. She walked down the stone aisle beneath banners embroidered, with lions and dragons, symbols of houses she had never known. Her gown was not her own. It was made by foreign hands, stitched in foreign style. Her hair had been plaited by a woman who didn't speak her name properly, and beside her, the groom, A man twice her age. A king. A stranger. He did not smile when she arrived. He barely looked at her. He bowed when it was time to bow. He said the vows when the bishop nodded. He placed the ring on her hand with the mechanical care of someone fastening armor, not touching flesh. That night, she sat on the edge of her new bed in a chamber high above the courtyard. She looked out at the moonlight on the stones, listened to the owls in the rafters, and waited. She had been taught to wait. No one had explained much, only that she was to be obedient and grateful, that a queen's role was to receive the will of her husband with dignity, that if she failed to fulfill her duty, she would bring shame to 2 crowns. The door opened, and so began her real life as a queen. But what they did not tell her, what no one ever said aloud, was how profoundly lonely this life would. For she was now queen of a land where she did not speak the tongue. Her every word had to pass through interpreters. Every slip of the tongue, every mispronounced syllable became a point of gossip. At court banquets, when noblemen toasted to alliances and told jokes, she had to smile without understanding, laugh when others laughed, nod when her ladies gave her the signal. Even her prayers had to be translated by the chaplain. She could not write home without her letters being read and sealed by royal scribes. Her mother's letters arrived less frequently now, delayed, edited, perhaps intercepted. In some cases, she feared they never arrived at all, and so she turned inward. She embroidered with intensity, not for decoration, but to focus her mind. She read the Psalms daily, reciting each line twice just to fill the silence. She learned the names of her maids, practiced her foreign vowels in front of the fire, and whispered questions to the nursemaids when no one was listening. She began to understand that there were 2 courts, one of words and one of whispers. The women around her, though sweet-faced and deferent, were not all friends. Some were placed there by other families. Some reported back to powerful barons. Some simply enjoyed the privilege of knowing a queen's secrets before the world did. She learned not to speak freely. She learned to smile without revealing anything, and she learned to listen. There was power in silence, power in patience, power in understanding what the men never noticed. When the king came to her chamber, he spoke little. He did not ask about her day. He did not ask how she was sleeping or if the food agreed with her. His presence was duty, his touch cold. There was no tenderness, only the clockwork routine of obligation. And then often he left without another word. Still she was expected to love him, or at least to appear as though she did. When she became pregnant, the entire court rejoiced, not for her health or happiness, but for the hope of an heir. Messengers rode for days to deliver the news to allied castles. A mass was held. Gifts were given. But the queen remained in her chambers. Alone she battled the nausea, the aches, the fevers. Alone she clutched her belly and prayed that this child would not die. Because she knew, if she failed to produce a son, her place in this court would shift. She would become less than, a foreign wife with no political weight. She lost that first child in the 5th month. There was no public mourning. Only silence, only a stiffer nod from the king at the next feast, only the whispers that followed her like shadows in the corridor. 2 years passed before her next pregnancy. This time the child was born alive. A daughter, small, red-faced, silent. And the queen held her to her chest and wept, not for joy but for fear, because she knew this child too would be married off one day. She knew her daughter's life would not be her own. Still, she kissed her gently, and in that quiet moment, behind the tapestry-covered walls of a distant castle, 2 royal women, held each other in silence, bound not by power but by pain. Her husband did not visit the child. He had hoped for a son. Instead, he left for campaign, and the queen returned to her daily rituals: oversight of the household, letters to minor nobles, patronage of local abbeys, management of dowries. She became at last fluent in the language, fluent in the politics of posture, fluent in the art of being just visible enough to be respected, but never enough to be feared. It was a dance, and she danced it for decades. In time, she bore 2 sons. Both lived. One would become king, the other a bishop. She had done her duty. Her place was secured. Her portrait was painted and hung beside her husband's in the great hall. She was given titles, lands, honors, but she remained alone. Her husband died before her, and when he did, she wore black for a full year, not because she grieved, but because mourning was mandatory. Her days became quieter after that. Her sons ruled. Her name faded from the council chamber. Her image was invoked in prayers but rarely in politics, and still she watched. She watched young women arrive at court, wrapped in silk, trying to navigate the same game she once played. She watched them smile too brightly, speak too quickly, trust too easily. She wanted to warn them, to tell them that the rules were older than any crown, and that no gown, no jewel, no wedding promise would ever protect them from the silence that came after. But queens do not give warnings. Queens endure. And so she sat in her chamber by the hearth, tracing the edges of a silver spoon with her fingertip, remembering the scent of the sea the day she first arrived, when she was only 15, and her name was not yet forgotten. The castle gardens looked serene from the upper balcony. Green hedges cut into precise shapes, gravel paths dusted with afternoon sunlight, roses blooming in pale, blushing pink. But down below, among the flowers and order, another scene played out. 2 noblewomen stood beside a young girl no older than 10. The girl held a slate in her hand, her fingers smudged with chalk dust. She was practicing her writing, 1 letter at a time, each stroke corrected and scrutinized. Her back was straight, her gaze steady, not because she was naturally disciplined, but because someone was always watching. She was a princess, and that meant she was not truly a child. In the medieval world, childhood for royal girls ended early, often before they even realized it had begun. While noble boys could climb trees, fall from horses, and roughhouse under the gaze of indulgent tutors, royal daughters were expected to embody grace before they even knew what it meant. At 7 years old, their daily routines were filled with posture training, speech lessons, embroidery practice, and memorization of scripture. They were not allowed to frown in public, even if their shoes hurt. They were not allowed to yawn during Mass. They were not allowed to raise their voices. Even in play, they were to be perfect, and yet they were not seen. Not really. A royal girl was an investment. She was a vessel for alliance, a future bride, a dowry in motion. Her thoughts, her dreams, her personality, none of that mattered. What mattered was her lineage, her purity, her usefulness to the crown. She was not encouraged to ask questions. She was encouraged to listen. Some did ask anyway. They asked why their brothers were taught swordsmanship while they were taught to pour wine with a steady hand. They asked why their lessons stopped at Latin and theology, while their male cousins studied astronomy and logic. They asked why a queen could not rule alone, even if she was wiser than the men at court. But such questions were answered with silence, or worse, with cold correction. A royal girl's curiosity was considered dangerous, and so she learned to hide it. Some wrote in secret, poems scribbled into prayer books, observations jotted in the margins of letters, coded messages tucked between verses of Scripture. Others expressed themselves through embroidery, threading entire arguments into the motifs of their tapestries: lions fighting snakes, vines strangling thorns, a woman walking into the sea. It was a silent rebellion, and it was one of the few kinds permitted. As she grew older, the pressure increased. Her tutors reported on her comportment. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to correct her if she showed improper affection, immoderate speech, or unsuitable enthusiasm. Even her moments of joy were scrutinized for decorum. Laughter was permitted, but only if it was soft and appropriate. When she began to bleed each month, a new protocol began. This was a signal to the court. She was now of marriageable age, and with that came the inspections. Quiet ones, discreet ones. Midwives were called to examine her posture, her hips, her skin. Herbalists were summoned to recommend potions that might strengthen her fertility. The almoner offered blessings. The bishop offered prayers. And then came the letters. Suitors sent ambassadors. Gifts arrived: lace from Florence, pearls from the Low Countries, a caged songbird from the East. Every gift was a test. Every courtship was a calculation. Her future. Husband might be a boy her age or a man 4 times her years. She would not be asked her preference. She might be married to settle a debt, to seal a truce, to prevent a war. And when the day came, when she stood beside that man in front of a golden altar, her face veiled, her hands trembling beneath a dozen rings, she would do as her mother had done, as her grandmother had done, as the queens before her had done. She would bow her head, she would smile, and she would disappear, not in body, but in self. The person she had been, the girl with questions, the girl with secret poems and dreams of gardens and ocean winds, would become a role, a title, a function. Her name would change, her household would change, her voice would soften, and everyone would call her lucky. To be royal, they said, was to be blessed. To be chosen by God, to live in palaces, eat from silver, be served by 10 hands at once. But they never spoke of the rest. They never spoke of the pressure that pressed down like chainmail, the endless hunger from tight corsets and constant fasting, the stomach-turning fear before every pregnancy, the despair when a child was born still, the ache of longing for someone to talk to, someone real, someone kind. They never spoke of the bruises from laced sleeves, the nights spent cold in a stone room, waiting for a husband who never came, the stiff smile at court banquets where she was praised as gracious while no one asked how she slept. They never spoke of how often she cried quietly into her pillow, and yet, through all of this, she survived. Some found strength in patronage. They sponsored abbeys, libraries, painters, and poets. They turned their sorrow into legacy. Others found solace in correspondence. Dozens of surviving letters between queens and their sisters revealed deep wells of tenderness, worry, and dry humor. In ink they lived again, and some simply endured, without poems, without letters, without names we remember. They endured because they had to, because their survival meant their children might live, because their silence might prevent a war, because their grace might win them allies, because their stillness was not passivity, it was defiance. And there were moments, brief, golden, rare, when they did feel joy, in the first smile of a newborn child, in the quiet morning prayer before anyone else stirred, in a secret gift from a lady's maid, a hair ribbon, a sweet, a folded note, in a moment alone in the garden, touching the bark of a tree, and knowing it would outlive them all. In these moments, they were not queens, not symbols, not vessels or pawns. They were simply women, tired, human, whole. And though history has forgotten most of their names, the stone halls remember. The worn floors where they once paced, the mirrors that caught their reflections. The scrolls where they wrote one careful line and then scratched it out, thinking better of it. The faded banners under which they whispered a single truth: I am still here. In the next part, we'll follow one such royal woman as she steps into widowhood, facing life after the crown in the quiet chambers of a crumbling court. She had always known this day would come. The room smelled of beeswax and damp stone. The fire had burned low, just a whisper of embers now. Outside, church bells tolled, slow and solemn. The rhythm echoed through the corridors of the castle, through the chambers and the kitchens, through every hallway where servants stood with bowed heads. The king was dead. Her husband, her political match, her public companion, her personal stranger, had died in the night, surrounded not by family but by clerics, doctors and guards. She had been summoned only after his final breath. The physician said it had been sudden, though nothing in this world ever was. Now the Queen Dowager stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face unreadable. This was not the first death she had witnessed. Not the first. Time she had stood in mourning clothes, but it was the first time she was expected to weep, not just as a wife, but as a widow. And yet, she felt no tears. There had been years of cold silences between them, years of ritual and restraint, of dinners eaten across long tables in draughty halls, of separate beds and public appearances, and children raised more by tutors than by love. And now the end. What followed was not rest, but protocol. A royal funeral was not a private thing. It was spectacle. Dozens of heralds were dispatched across the kingdom to announce the king's death. Black banners were hung from the towers. Candles burned in the cathedral, hundreds at once. A parade of clergy and courtiers followed the coffin, as it was carried through the streets, and she, the widow, led them. Draped in layers of mourning cloth, a heavy black veil covering her face, she moved slowly down the nave of the cathedral, each step deliberate, each gesture symbolic. She was the image of grief. No one could see her eyes, no one could see how they did not weep. For royal women even mourning was scripted. A queen could not collapse in sorrow. She could not abandon her duties. She could not retreat entirely from court. Not yet. First, she had to complete the rituals of widowhood. For the next 40 days, she would wear black. Her chambers would be draped in dark cloth. She would take no part in festivities. She would eat alone. She would light candles for his soul and recite prayers before his tomb. She would speak softly, walk slowly, and avoid all music and laughter. It was not just tradition, it was law. To fail in mourning was to invite scandal. A queen who smiled too soon, who dressed too brightly, who engaged too quickly in court affairs, she risked being seen as unfaithful, disloyal, or even complicit. So she moved through those 40 days like a statue carved of iron, her sorrow shaped to fit the expectations of those around her. But inside, something shifted. With the king's death, a strange freedom opened before her. No longer a consort, she was now a dowager. No longer bound to the king's bed, she had her own household. No longer watched through the lens of marital duty, she could now live, quietly but more truly. In many courts, a queen dowager was sent away to a separate residence, a smaller castle, a quieter manor, a distant abbey. The official reason was respect. to allow the new queen, if there was one, to establish her household without rivalry. But the truth was simpler. Power feared women who had nothing left to lose, and so she went, not in disgrace, but in retreat. Her new home was a grey stone manor near the woods, surrounded by damp fields and old trees. There were fewer servants, fewer visitors. The halls echoed with the sounds of wind and birds, and sometimes silence so deep it pressed against the ribs. But she was not alone. She had her books, her letters, her memories. She had a garden, overgrown and wild, where she would walk each morning, in a long dark cloak, and pick herbs with fingers that had once held scepters. She also had grief, real grief, not for the king perhaps, but for the decades lost to duty, for the self she had silenced, for the child she buried long ago and had never been allowed to mourn properly, for the friend she loved more than she ever loved her husband, a lady-in-waiting whose name was never written in any chronicle. In widowhood she could remember freely. She could cry not for public ceremony but for herself. Other women joined her there, a cousin who had been widowed twice, a niece sent to the country after her husband's scandal, a former rival, now softened by time. Together they read, embroidered, prayed. Sometimes they laughed, and sometimes they said nothing for hours, and it was enough. This space, this quiet, forgotten space, was where royal women finally lived, away from court, away from marriage, away from expectations. It was here they wrote their wills, not just of gold and land, but of thoughts and fears. It was here they passed on their knowledge, not through scrolls or laws, but through stories told over needlework, through careful advice whispered to young girls sent to visit them, through gestures as old as their lineage. One dowager queen taught astronomy to her granddaughter using pebbles and candlelight. Another taught herbal medicine, how to draw fever from the body with crushed willow bark. Another simply taught kindness, how to hold someone's hand when the news was bad, how to sit in silence and let sorrow be. History rarely writes of these years. It records the coronations, the marriages, the heirs. It records when a queen entered power and when she left it. But it does not record the decades after, the seasons spent in gardens, the letters written in a hand slowly growing frail, the prayers whispered for sons who never wrote back. But those years mattered. They mattered because they were real, because they were lived, because they held the truth of what it meant to be royal and female and human. And when at last the Queen Dowager died, alone, in a bed she had chosen, in a room warmed by a fire she had lit herself, her passing was not marked by the toll of cathedral bells, not by banners or parades. It was marked only by the soft hush of wind through ivy, by the silence of servants standing still, by the fading warmth of her last candle. They buried her beside the king, because that was custom. But her spirit lived somewhere else, in the ink of her letters, in the seeds she planted, in the memories of the girls she taught to be gentle and unafraid. In the next part, we will walk alongside one of those young girls, a daughter of royalty raised not to rule but to obey, and what happened when she chose to break free. The girl's fingers were red from the cold. She had been writing at her desk since dawn, ink pooling in the corners of each careful letter. The castle chapel bells had rung twice already, once for morning prayer, once for mass. But she hadn't moved. She wasn't writing scripture or copying sermons. She was writing her name, over and over again. Not the name she had been given at baptism, the long, dignified, dynasty-soaked name that rolled off the tongue like a royal decree. Oh, this was the name she whispered to herself when no one was around. a name she had imagined when she looked at the night sky, a name with fewer syllables and no title in front of it, just her. She was the third daughter of a king, and that meant she had no real power and no real freedom. She would not inherit land. She would not be crowned. She would not lead armies or attend councils or sign laws into being. Her brothers would do that. Her older sister had already been married off to a kingdom far across the sea. Her younger sister was still small, still soft, still allowed to play in the nursery. But she was 12 now, and that meant her fate was being quietly discussed behind every closed door. The girl knew. She heard the whispers. At night, when the fire had burned low and the ladies believed her asleep, she listened to the rustle of fabric and the hush of voices. One baron's son had been suggested, a distant relative of a duke, even, horrifyingly, a much older widower who had recently lost his third wife. "He needs a gentle one this time," the lady had said, as if speaking of a horse. She didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she had begun writing her name in secret. Not the name of a princess, but the name of a person. She kept the pages hidden beneath the straw mattress in her chamber, pages filled with questions. Not just about marriage, but about everything. Why must women wear veils when speaking to clergy? Why are girls not taught to read the same texts as boys? Why do queens bow to bishops if God made us equal? No one gave her answers, but someone noticed. The old nursemaid, the one with hair like dandelion fluff and hands always smelling of thyme, found the papers one day while sweeping. She said nothing, only paused, held the parchment to the candlelight for a moment, and then tucked it back where she found it. That night she gave the girl a small tin of ink as a gift. "For your thoughts," she said, and so the writing continued. But writing was not rebellion. Not yet. She still attended her posture lessons, still recited her psalms, still walked with careful grace beside her mother at court banquets, eyes lowered, lips smiling just enough. Until one night, one quiet, moonless night, everything shifted. It began with a knock at her chamber door. She was reading by the fire, a book of saints, heavy and old. Most of it was in Latin, and much of it she didn't understand. But she liked the way the words looked on the page, like secret messages from a world that had existed long before she was born. The knock was not her maid, not her nurse, not even one of her sisters. It was the bishop's secretary. He looked solemn. He carried a scroll. "His Grace wishes to speak with you," he said, bowing. "The bishop—" She felt her stomach twist. She was escorted down through the stone corridors, past the locked chapel doors, and into a side room near the vestry, a cold room with one candle, one chair, and the bishop. He held her letters. All of them. Unrolled, exposed, her words read by eyes not meant to see them. "What is this?" he asked gently. She tried to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. A child, questioning the nature of holy. Order? A girl comparing herself to the apostles? Speaking of equality? Of learning? This is dangerous, he smiled. Softly. Too softly. Luckily, you are still young. This can be corrected. Your father must never know. We will have you focus more on prayer, less on ink, more on fasting, less on thought. And just like that, her voice was taken, or so they believed. In the weeks that followed, her letters were burned, her writing tools restricted, her lessons doubled. She was not allowed to read without supervision. She was assigned a new chaperone, a grim, watchful woman with fingers like iron twigs and a face that never blinked. She was being reshaped. She did not fight, not outwardly, but deep within, something rooted, Something refused. One night she crept from her chamber with nothing but a candle and a piece of charcoal. She knelt beside the cold stone wall near the base of the servants' stairwell, the part of the castle no one cared to clean, and she wrote just one sentence: "I am still here." She returned the next night, and the next, each time adding more words. A sentence about freedom, a thought about truth, a poem about stars, a memory of her sister, a question without an answer. The wall became her book. By the end of the month, the entire lower corridor was filled with her secret script, faint, smudged, nearly invisible in daylight. But it was there. She was there. And then came the summons. A marriage had been arranged. A minor prince from the north, polite, educated, ambitious. She was to be sent within the month. The dowry had been prepared, the contract signed, her future sealed. There was no ceremony, no grand announcement, only a nod from her father at breakfast. Only a small silver ring placed in her hand by her mother later that evening. Only the quiet sound of her favorite nursemaid crying softly into her apron as she packed the girl's combs into a box. And then, the journey. The snow fell as she left, thin flakes brushing against the carriage window. She stared through them, her face blank, but in her hand, tucked deep inside her sleeve, was a small scrap of parchment. The last thing she had written before leaving. "You can take the ink, but not the fire." She arrived at her new home days later, a smaller court, strangers, new rules, a husband who watched her carefully, but said very little. And so she began. Again, a different wall this time. Behind the tapestries, inside the linen closet, etchings made with candle soot, words written on bread crust and hidden in books, whispered lines into the ears of trusted maids, not loud, not defiant, just steady. She would not be remembered in history books. She would not become queen. But in the servants' corridors of two distant castles, there were still faint words on stone, smudged charcoal, secret thoughts, forgotten sentences written by a girl who would not be quieted. And in the next part, we'll travel to one of the few places where royal women held true power, not in palaces or thrones, but in abbeys and convents, where the silence spoke louder than any crown. The abbey stood at the edge of a pine forest, built into the curve of a green hillside where the mist never fully lifted. Its stone walls were old, older than most kingdoms. Ivy crept across the east side like a second skin. Beyond the walls were rows of gardens, simple and quiet, filled with herbs and pale flowers that bowed in the wind. This place was not meant to impress. There were no grand arches or golden tapestries, no clamor of trumpets, no court gossip echoing down polished corridors. The silence here was deeper, thicker. It settled over everything like moss, and in that silence lived women who had once worn crowns. They were abbesses, nuns, novices, and many of them had once been queens. When a royal woman entered a convent in the medieval world, it was often seen as the end of her story. A retreat. Her soft exile, a gentle vanishing into prayer and stone. But inside those high walls a different kind of life began, one without court duties or royal rituals, one where power still existed, but quietly beneath the surface. Many of these women did not come to the abbey by choice. Some were widows, sent away after the death of their husbands. Some were daughters deemed too rebellious, too political, too inconvenient to marry off. Others had suffered scandal, or had caused it, and were removed from public life for the safety of the family name. But some chose it. Some looked at the path laid before them. Marriage to a stranger, endless childbearing, court politics, silent, suffering, and said no. They chose instead the veil, and while the world believed they had vanished, they had not. Behind those stone walls, they studied. Abbesses in particular held immense knowledge. They managed land, signed contracts, oversaw tenants. They ran the day-to-day functions of large religious estates. Some abbesses controlled more territory than local lords. They supervised scribes, scholars, herb gardens, wine cellars, even schools for noble girls. They spoke Latin fluently. Some read Greek. Others copied manuscripts with careful, aching precision by candlelight, psalters, medicinal texts, ancient poetry. They were the quiet keepers of memory, and unlike the courts where women's voices were drowned beneath politics and pageantry, the convent allowed those voices to rise. Here, royal women did not wear jeweled crowns. They wore hoods, but some said that in the stillness of the chapel, when the evening bells rang and the firelight flickered, you could see a different kind of majesty in their eyes. Not the majesty of rule, but of wisdom, of knowing they had survived. Take the case of one queen, her name lost now to time, but the story still whispered in the monastery archives. She had married young, as most did. Her husband was powerful, unpredictable. The court was dangerous. 2 of her maids vanished within the same winter. A cousin was poisoned, a bishop exiled. She smiled through all of it, gave birth to 3 children, attended feast after feast, and then, when her husband died suddenly after a fall from his horse, she made her choice. She did not remarry. She did not stay. She took her dowry and founded an abbey. Not just any abbey, a strong one. Built with her own seal, on land her husband had once promised to a rival. She filled it with books, with women who had nowhere else to go. She turned it into a place of learning, of safety, of quiet defiance, and when she died decades later, her epitaph read only, "She kept silence, and in silence she taught the world." Convents were not always gentle. There was hierarchy, discipline, fasting, nights spent in stone cells with nothing but a thin blanket and a crucifix. There were early morning prayers before sunrise, and long hours spent copying texts or grinding herbs for medicine. But to the women who had lived at court, to those who had endured childbirth after childbirth, who had smiled through betrayal, who had been watched and judged and weighed, the silence of the convent was not punishment. It was peace. There they were not touched without permission. There their words were written, not dismissed. There they aged without shame. There they remembered, and remembering was powerful, because to remember meant to resist the forgetting that history so often brought. These women remembered their mothers, their sisters, the ones who died too soon, the ones who vanished into the roles they were assigned. They remembered what it cost to be obedient. They remembered the cold rooms, the forced smiles, the letters never answered, and in small ways they recorded it. A note scribbled in the margin of a psalm, a recipe passed down with a story, a stitched symbol in the hem of a new novice's robe. Not loud rebellion, not fire and sword, but something slower, something that lasted longer. Some convents even offered sanctuary to other women, noble women fleeing abusive husbands, daughters hiding from political marriages, widows trying to keep their lands from greedy in-laws. The abbesses negotiated, appealed to bishops, protected the weak with the weight of their own royal names, and though the world beyond often scoffed at women behind walls, those walls held more strength than most castles. But the world did not leave them alone forever. Even in the convent, politics reached in. kings sent spies. Bishops demanded obedience. Sometimes a young nun would be called back to court, forced to break her vows for a marriage that served political gain. Sometimes the convent's lands were seized, sometimes its books were burned. But still, women persisted. Some prayed louder, some wrote more carefully, some simply waited like stone itself until the danger passed. And in time, when they grew old, when their hands curled from years of writing, when their eyes dimmed from candlelight, when their legs no longer walked the cloister path without pain, they sat by the fire and told stories. Stories of queens who held knives in their sleeves, of princesses who buried their dreams beneath chapel floors, of noble women who rode alone at night to rescue their daughters, of girls who were told to be silent and who found instead a way to sing, not with music, but with memory. In the final seasons of their lives, many of these royal women became teachers, not formally but simply by being present. Young novices sat at their feet, wrapped in cloaks, listening to tales that would never be written. Lessons not found in scripture, advice not approved by bishops, but true. The kind of truth passed from woman to woman, across generations, and when these women finally passed, buried in plain stone tombs with no gold, no heraldry, no painted likeness, their abbeys mourned them not with bells or fanfare, but with silence, a deep, reverent silence, a silence that carried their legacy better than any monument ever could. In the next part, we return to the castle, this time not for queens or dowagers, but for the young royal girls caught in the cruel machinery of medieval marriage markets, girls who learned to play the game far earlier than they should have. She was 7 when the match was first proposed. It happened not in a grand council chamber or beneath the painted vaults of a cathedral, but at a table beside a fire during a winter that would not end. Outside, the snow pressed thick against the windows, muting the world. Inside, her father and 2 advisers leaned over a parchment, their voices low but firm. "She's of age," one said. "She's a child," her mother replied, her voice like ice. "That hasn't stopped anyone before." The girl sat on the floor near the hearth, quietly feeding scraps of bread to a half-blind cat, unaware of the papers that were quietly reshaping her future. In the royal courts of medieval Europe, daughters were not simply children, they were currency. Their bodies were lines on a map, their hands the handshake of nations. To have a royal daughter was to possess a bargaining chip, a way to secure borders, end feuds, or sweeten alliances. And the earlier those deals were struck, the better. The child might not be married for years, but the promise would be made early. Betrothal contracts were drafted with the same care as war treaties. Titles were traded like favors. And through it all, the girls themselves remained quiet, compliant, smiling. The royal marriage market was vast, stretching from cold Nordic fortresses to the golden halls of Iberia, from French chateaux to Italian city-states. Every court had daughters to offer, and every king had a list of sons to place. The girl's name was written in ink beside the name of a boy she had never seen. He was 9, she was 7. It would be a strong match. And so the instructions began. She was to learn his language, learn the etiquette of his court, practice the correct prayers and feast day customs. Her governess read her stories from his homeland, tales of kings and saints and warriors, told in the rhythms of a language that tasted strange in her mouth. By 8, she could recite all of his grandfather's victories. By 9, she could name every duchy in his kingdom. By 10, she had stopped playing. There were no dolls in her chamber, no childish drawings on the walls. Instead, Her room was lined with prayer books, embroidery hoops, and scrolls of etiquette. She practiced walking slowly, speaking softly, sitting with grace. She learned the difference between 6 types of wine, even though she would not drink them for years. She learned how to bow with just enough deference, not too deep, not too shallow. She learned to vanish into perfection. The idea of love was never mentioned. Romance was a sin of the poets. A foolish invention. What mattered was service, obedience, dignity. A royal bride was not expected to love her husband. She was expected to honor him, serve him, and bear his sons. If affection grew, it was considered a blessing. If not, the key. Marriage would continue regardless. At 12, she received her first gift from him, a ring too large for her finger, sent with a note in a hand not his. The letter spoke of honor and duty, of the noble bond between their houses, of the blessings of God upon their union. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it under her pillow. The ring stayed in its box. She saw him for the first time a year later, during a formal meeting of the 2 courts. He was tall, awkward, his voice not yet settled. They did not speak. They stood beside each other for the length of a ceremony, then rode off in separate carriages. That night, she was told that the wedding would take place within the year. She was 13. It was spring. The ceremony was magnificent. The banners, the procession, the cathedral filled with gold light and thick incense. She wore a gown so heavy she could barely breathe. Her hair was braided and scented with lavender. Her hands were trembling. There was music. There were blessings. And when the vows were said, her new husband touched her hand for the first time. It was cold. The wedding feast lasted hours. Lords and ladies drank and laughed. Dancers spun in the candlelight. Her new husband sat beside her, quiet, polite, bored. She barely touched her food. She smiled. She nodded. She endured. That night she was led to her chamber by 2 older women, a midwife and a chaperone. The bed had been prepared, the sheets warmed. A candle burned on the table beside a bowl of water and a clean cloth. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame. When he entered, she stood, and so it began. The days that followed were a blur of rituals and requirements. She was to be seen at court every morning, in a different gown each day. She was to oversee the household in her husband's absence. She was to write to her family regularly, but not too often. She was to remain silent during council meetings. Unless directly asked, she was watched, always by her ladies-in-waiting, by the steward, by the priests, by the servants. She could not weep. She could not falter. She could not speak of the things she did not yet understand. The ache in her ribs from corsets worn too tightly, the strange bruises that appeared after nights she could not remember clearly, the nausea that came with certain scents and stayed with her through meals. She was 15 when the first pregnancy came. The child did not survive. She was 16 when the second arrived. A daughter, healthy, small, quiet. Her husband did not. Visit. The court barely acknowledged it. It was not until her third child, a son, that the bells rang in celebration. Her place was now secure. But her soul had grown quiet. She no longer wrote letters. She no longer wandered the gardens. She no longer watched the moon through the windows. She performed. She functioned. She existed. And yet, somewhere inside, a memory remained. A girl feeding bread to a cat beside a fire. A girl who didn't know, yet that she would become a name on a marriage contract. A girl who once drew stars in the margins of her prayer book. That memory flickered in her mind on cold nights, when the castle was still and the wind howled through the corridors, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes she let it live. In a quiet moment beside her daughter's bed, telling stories not from scripture, but from her own mind. In the way she arranged the flowers in the chapel, never the same way twice. In the simple act of walking barefoot just once across the cold stone floor, because it reminded her she was still alive. Not just a bride, not just a mother, but a person. In the next part, we'll enter the world of royal mistresses, the women who existed on the edges of the crown, neither queens nor wives, but with power that both fascinated and terrified the court. She was never meant to be remembered. She was not born of noble blood. Her father worked the stables behind a provincial manor, and her mother served in the kitchens. She grew up near horses and smoke, not tapestries and gold. Her world was filled with calloused hands, cracked heels, the scent of iron and vinegar. But she was beautiful, not in the way of paintings or sculpture, not a perfect, icy statue. Her beauty was quieter, slow-moving, sun-warmed, alive. Her eyes were curious, her smile watchful. She did not speak when she didn't need to, and when she did, people leaned closer without realizing why. She entered the palace at 16, brought in as a laundry maid during a particularly hard winter when several servants had died of fever. She was small, quick, unnoticed. For months, she scrubbed linen in cold water, her hands raw from the lye, her back sore from hauling baskets, but she listened, always listening. That was how she learned the king's habits. He took his supper in the upper solar on Fridays. He preferred boiled pears to stewed apples. He disliked the scent of lavender, but always accepted gifts of it from his wife's relatives, out of courtesy. He bathed only once per week, on Sundays, and always after confession. It wasn't that she wanted his attention, but one night, while placing warm sheets on his bed, she looked up too slowly. Their eyes met, and the story began. In medieval courts, the role of the royal mistress was never official, but it was very real. These women were ghosts in velvet, half present, half forbidden. They lived in shadowed rooms behind the throne. Their names known but never spoken aloud. They were not queens, but they were powerful. Some were taken by force, others by charm. Some entered willingly, calculating the advantages. A few, perhaps, even loved the men who claimed them. But love was dangerous. A mistress might be praised in song one day and slandered in sermon the next. She had no protection, no crown, no vows. Her power came only from the king's favor, and when that favor waned, so did everything else. Still, many survived, and some thrived. They were gifted estates, gowns, jewels, given apartments within the castle. Their sons were sometimes recognized, if not as heirs, then as noble bastards. Their opinions shaped policy more often than the queen's. Some even whispered in the ears of generals and bishops. And yet they lived on a knife's edge. Every smile could be misread, every gesture examined. If the king's wife bore a son, the mistress might be quietly moved to another estate. If she angered a noble ally, rumors might surface. Witchcraft, seduction, treason. If she was clever, she survived by appearing soft. This girl, the stable-hand's daughter, was clever. She never dressed above her station, never demanded, never spoke ill of the queen, though others tried to provoke her. She smiled, she served. She waited and she watched how the queen clenched her hands during court, how the duke's wife always entered rooms 5 paces behind her husband, but looked to the windows instead of the floor. She watched which servants were trusted, which doors were locked, which priests looked too long during confession. And she remembered. The king was kind to her at first. He sent her a comb carved from ivory, slippers sewn with red thread, a lapdog that barked only when thunder struck. He did not speak to her of politics, but she listened nonetheless. In time, she began to gather favors. A lady-in-waiting owed her a secret. A court scribe once kissed her hand in the dark. A merchant's son taught her to read by the light of a single taper, smuggling her scraps of parchment like they were gold. She learned the game. When she became pregnant, the court buzzed. The child was a boy, strong, with the king's eyes. He was named and raised not by her, but by a noblewoman paid handsomely for the service. She saw him only from afar during feast days, standing behind a column while the court celebrated without seeing her. She bore 2 more children. Both lived. Neither were named in any chronicle. Still she stayed, not by begging, but by mastering stillness. A mistress in the medieval world was both everything and nothing. She existed in half-light. She sat in the margins of portraits, if at all. Her voice was soft, her influence unspoken. But she knew things no one else did. She knew which nobleman took bribes, which priest fathered children in secret, which lady of the court drank bitter herbs each month to prevent pregnancy. She held the court's pulse in the palm of her hand. But the king grew older. His health failed. His affections shifted. A new girl appeared, younger, louder, less cautious. The court turned its eyes toward her, and so the stable-hand's daughter, now older than the queen had ever been, found herself standing once more in the cold. This time not as a maid, not as a lover, but as something else entirely, an outsider. They sent her away, not cruelly. She was given land, a house near the edge of the forest. Servants, yes, but fewer. Finery, yes, but simpler. A chapel where she could pray for her sins. She was not angry. She did not mourn. She rose early, walked in the woods, spoke to no one unless necessary. She kept her letters sealed and her stories to herself. But in her garden, beneath the moss-covered wall, she planted a tree. Under that tree she buried something small, a lock of her child's hair, a ring she never wore, a folded page of her own handwriting, the only thing she had ever written not meant for someone else. I saw everything. I said nothing. I was not a queen, but I knew what they feared. She lived many years, grew thin, went grey, lost her hearing in one ear. When she died, her name was not listed among the royal dead. She had no title, but her story lived on, in the whispers of servants, in the footnotes of letters, in the diary of a visiting nun who once wrote, "The king's old mistress lives still, wiser than the bishops, quieter than the priests." In the next part, we step deeper into the role of royal daughters who were promised not to men, but to the church, brides of Christ, cloistered in stone, used not for their beauty, but for their bloodline, and their silence. There were 2 kinds of brides in the medieval royal world. The first kind walked beneath cathedral arches in silk and gold, given from one house to another in front of bishops, lords, and 100 witnesses. They were married to men, princes, dukes or kings. Their futures were mapped through bloodlines and treaties. Their lives played out in public, but the second kind disappeared. They were married to God. Royal daughters, often the younger ones, were offered to the church, not always out of piety but out of politics. Not every girl could be wed to a king, and it was considered honorable, convenient even, to dedicate a daughter to the religious life, to send her away before she could make trouble, to silence her without cruelty, to preserve her dignity while removing her from the game. They called it a vocation, but for many of these girls it began not with a calling, but with a command. She was 12 when the announcement was made. There had been no warning. No conversation, just a folded letter handed to her governess one morning and a new dress waiting by evening. Plain grey wool with a modest neckline and no adornments. She wasn't told why, only that she would leave in 2 days. The abbey was a day's ride north, tucked between low hills and hidden by orchards. It had once been a monastery, then converted to house noblewomen only. The walls were high, the gates were iron. The nuns wore white hoods that covered everything but their eyes. There were no mirrors. Her escort left her at the gates and said, "Nothing." She was 13 the day she received her veil. The ceremony was quiet, simple. She was dressed in white, kneeling before the altar, while the abbess spoke Latin verses above her head. The veil was placed carefully, gently, as if it didn't weigh more than a crown. The ring on her finger was gold, cold and symbolic. She was now a bride, but there would be no feasts, no children, no songs, only silence. In the royal courts, her absence was noted for a moment. A brief pause in the gossip. A single nod from her father during a banquet as if to say, "Another duty fulfilled." But in the abbey her life was just beginning, and it was not kind. The rules were strict. No speaking outside permitted hours. No possessions except what was assigned. No letters sent or received without inspection. Meals were plain, barley, broth, black bread, water. Once a month they were allowed wine. They rose before sunrise, prayed before eating, worked in silence. They copied manuscripts, tended gardens, washed linen, ground grain. The labor was constant, unrelenting, meant to teach humility, discipline, obedience. She said nothing for weeks. Her hands blistered, her eyes ached from reading, her back hurt from kneeling, but she endured. And slowly she began to see things others missed. The abbess carried a ring with a hidden compartment, containing a relic no one spoke of. The older nuns moved between prayers with subtle gestures, patterns, signals, unspoken codes. One of the novices always wore her veil crooked, and yet no one corrected her. The young scribe often paused mid-copying, staring too long at a particular passage in the Psalms. There were secrets here, and where there are secrets, there is power. It was not the power of kings or armies. It was slower, older, softer, but it shaped lives just the same. She learned to read more than words. She learned tone, expression, timing. She learned which prayers were real and which were routine. She learned that some women had chosen this life, while others, like her, had simply adapted. One nun had once been a countess, another the widow of a powerful general. One had run from a forced marriage, another from shame. All wore the same habit, all obeyed the same rule. But beneath the silence they carried entire worlds. In time the girl became one of them, not bitter, not broken, just reshaped. She found comfort in routine, a strange kind of peace in knowing each day's rhythm. She learned to chant, to cook, to administer herbs. She could stitch a torn robe with 6 kinds of thread and prepare a body for burial without flinching, and she learned to lead. When the abbess grew ill, it was she who took over the morning prayers. She who organized the copying of texts. She who negotiated with local merchants for supplies. She who managed the accounts and inspected the wine. She was 22 when she became abbess herself. And though the crown never acknowledged it, she now governed land, wealth, labor, and souls. Men bowed when they entered her presence. Her signature sealed documents. Her voice decided disputes. and her silence commanded respect. She never returned to court, but her name reached it eventually, spoken in hushed tones by clerics, in letters between noblewomen, in the whispered advice of grandmothers to their sons. "She is there," they said, "still unmarried, still watching." Some feared her, some envied her, some forgot her, but she remembered everything. She remembered the cold stone of the abbey gates, the feel of the veil against her forehead, the taste of her first vow, and she remembered her sister, still at court, still smiling, still playing the game. They wrote letters sometimes, carefully worded, inspected before delivery, but each one ended with the same line: "You were made to be a queen, I was made to disappear, and yet I remain." She died in winter-old quiet revered. The abbey bells rang for hours. The nuns buried her in the chapel garden, beneath the yew trees, with no name carved into the stone, only a cross and a single line of Latin. She chose the quiet, and the quiet chose her. In the next part, we return once more to the royal palace, not to the throne or chapel, but to the nursery, where future queens were shaped before they could even speak, and where silence was taught long before speech. The nursery was quiet, not silent. There were always sounds in the background, the rustle of fabric, the clicking of wooden toys, the faint clink of a spoon against a pewter bowl. But it was a practiced quiet, a hush, learned early and maintained. Strictly, no shouting, no tantrums, no childish bursts of freedom. Even the laughter was soft, contained. This was the nursery of a royal household. It was not a place of whimsy or warmth. Not truly. The walls were high and painted with delicate scenes, saints, angels, kings, but the fire was never quite enough to warm the corners, and the rugs were thin, laid more for appearances than comfort. There were toys, yes, but they were carved with care, not abundance, everything in its place, everything with a purpose, and within this space, so measured, so deliberate, grew the future women of the realm. Princesses. From the moment they took their first breath, they were under watch. Midwives whispered of omens. Wet nurses were assigned based not only on skill but on bloodline. The cradle was placed in a sunlit corner, but always beneath the virgin's gaze, as if to remind the room that this was not a child. It was a vessel, a symbol of peace, of alliance, of bloodline. Dove power. She was 3 when she was first scolded for walking too quickly, 4 when her voice was corrected for being too loud, 5 when her posture was corrected by a light slap to the wrist. Not cruel, just firm, just enough to remind her, for that her body was not entirely her own. By 6 she had already learned how to curtsy, how to hold a goblet properly, how to accept praise with humility. Her governess corrected her speech constantly. Speak slowly, clearly, never answer unless asked. These weren't suggestions. They were survival. She was praised for her grace, her beauty, her quiet dignity. But she did not know who she was, only what others told her to be. Every moment in the nursery was preparation, not for joy, not for play, but for presentation. Visitors, ambassadors, nobles, clerics were brought in to observe her. She would be asked to sing, to recite a verse, to smile but not too widely, to answer questions like, "And what will you be when you grow up?" The answer was always the same: "I will serve my family. I will serve God." She did not yet know what that meant, but she knew to say it. The royal nursery was divided by gender and by future. The boys learned with tutors, mathematics, scripture, law, warcraft. They were allowed outside more often. They rode ponies, shot arrows, argued with their teachers. The girls had different lessons. They learned embroidery, singing, Latin prayers, how to mix a cordial for upset stomachs, how to walk without making noise, how to sit for portraits without moving their eyes. They learned music not to perform, but to soothe. They were trained in every art of soft power, flattery, grace, silence. But the most important lesson, endurance. By the age of 8, most royal girls understood what was expected of them. Their names were already being passed between noble houses like cards in a slow game. She is well behaved. She has her mother's nose. She will grow tall. She is fertile stock. They didn't always hear these words directly, but they felt them, in the glances, in the sudden silences, in the way their mothers looked away too quickly. Royal mothers were often distant figures, not cold necessarily, but restrained. They visited the nursery according to schedule. They praised accomplishments with a touch, not an embrace. They reminded their daughters of what they must become. "It will not be easy," they said, "but you are not like the others. You are royal." Royal, a word that sounded like a compliment, but it was a cage. By 10, she was fitted for her first real corset. Not tight, not yet. Just enough to remind her what adulthood would feel like. The nurse laced it gently, her face unreadable. The girl didn't cry. That would have been undignified. 11? She learned to read between the lines of letters. The governess would have her study correspondence between queens, coded phrases, formal greetings that masked entire political maneuvers. She learned how to recognize a threat hidden inside a compliment, how to spot envy in a prayer. She learned, too, how to hide her own thoughts. At night, when the fires had died and the other girls slept, she sometimes lay awake and stared at the ceiling. She wondered what the outside world smelled like, what the markets looked like, what it felt like to run until your legs ached. She would never know, not truly, not safely, but she imagined it. That was the one freedom no one could take. Sometimes a lady's maid would bring stories, old legends whispered after lights out, tales of queens who escaped into the woods, of princesses who rode horses dressed as men, of women who vanished and were never found. She loved those stories, clung to them, even when she knew they weren't true, even when she knew that if she ever tried to run, she would be caught before she crossed the first hill. At 12, she was moved from the nursery to the maidens' chambers, a rite of passage. The rooms were colder, the rules stricter. She was assigned a lady-in-waiting and a new routine. She spent her days in study, her evenings in prayer, her nights learning to sleep without dreams. The nursery was forgotten, swept, locked, repainted for the next generation, and so the cycle began again. The little girls with quiet feet and perfect smiles growing up in the shadow of kings, learning early that their bodies were not for them, that their thoughts had to be softened, that their words would only be safe if they were brief, beautiful, and agreeable. But even in that nursery, beneath the tapestries, behind the music, within the thick hush, some of those girls were already learning to see the cracks. They noticed which servants whispered to each other, which priests looked too long, which tutors favored certain girls for reasons never spoken. They noticed when the queen's visits grew less frequent. They noticed when a girl was sent away and never mentioned again, and some of them remembered. Not all would survive the journey from nursery to throne, but a few would. And they would carry those memories into their marriages, into their courts, into their quiet conversations in candle-lit chambers. They would pass the warnings to their own daughters wordlessly, in the flick of a fan or the choice of a lullaby, because the nursery may have taught them silence, but it also taught them how to see. And in the next part, we follow one of those. Girls into her first year as queen, when the real lessons began, and the crown grew heavier than anyone ever warned her. The crown was lighter than she expected, and colder. It had been resting on a velvet cushion in the royal chapel all morning, surrounded by incense and sunlight and the long hum of monks chanting through the litany of saints. It gleamed. Gold and gems and polished metal, forged generations ago to fit dozens of royal brows, but never truly designed to fit a girl who still wasn't sure if she was a woman yet. She was 16, and she was queen. The wedding had taken place just days before. Her gown had been white and silver, her hands carefully perfumed with rose water. She had spoken her vows with perfect clarity, her voice echoing across the cathedral like a line of poetry. She had done everything right, and still, when the guests left and the torches were extinguished, and the doors to her new chambers closed with a soft thud, she felt hollow. Because the crown, as they had all told her, was not a gift. It was a weight. The coronation was quick. No feasting afterward, just formality. The bishop placed the crown on her head while two ladies-in-waiting supported the hem of her gown. The archduke looked on, his face unreadable. He had once written her a poem in Latin during their betrothal. He had not spoken a word to her since the ceremony. That night she was expected to preside over the first state dinner. She did not eat. She smiled. She made polite conversation with lords whose names she barely remembered, and laughed softly when they complimented her French. Her hands did not tremble. Her spine stayed straight. Her crown stayed in place. No one saw her exhale. Being queen was not like the stories. There were no moments of quiet elegance beside sunlit windows, no meaningful conversations in hidden gardens, no freedom to wander the halls barefoot at night. There were rules more than before. She could not eat certain foods, not in public. She could not leave her chambers without at least 2 attendants. She could not speak to servants without permission. Every letter she wrote was copied and archived. Every gift she received was inspected. Every word she spoke could be repeated, and she was never alone, not truly. Even when she lay in bed at night, her maid curled up quietly in a corner, the guards pacing just outside the chamber door, the sound of footsteps always just near enough to remind her, "You are not a person. You are a symbol." She had a diary once, back when she was still a princess. She burned it 3 days after the coronation. Her duties began before dawn. Mass in the private chapel, review of court petitions, supervised readings of diplomatic messages, appearance in the audience chamber, walk through the gardens, public, accompanied, brief. Then came embroidery sessions, hosted for noble daughters. They were meant to soften her image, to build bonds between families, to demonstrate her femininity. She was not permitted to embroider anything dark. No hunting scenes, no heraldic beasts, only florals. Pastoral images, prayers. She stitched for hours, and in her mind she rehearsed her real thoughts. Who had lied during council? Who was unhappy at court? Who kept glancing toward the treasury books? She learned quickly, faster than they wanted her. They assumed she would be docile, decorative. A bride turned queen by the grace of God and the will of men. But she was watching. She saw how the chancellor favored his nephews for land grants. She saw how the steward underpaid the kitchen staff and pocketed the difference. She saw how the bishop hesitated before reading the second page of a papal letter, because he knew she could read Latin just as well as he could. She spoke rarely in meetings, but when she did, her words landed with precision, and that made people uncomfortable. The king, her husband, tolerated her, perhaps even respected her, but he did not love her, nor did he pretend to. He gave her jewels, rooms, horses, but not trust, not warmth. Their conversations were brief, factual, and always in the presence of others. Their marriage was one of convenience, of tradition, of unspoken negotiations. He had mistresses. She knew. One of them once bowed too deeply in her presence, lips trembling. The Queen said nothing. She didn't need to. She understood the hierarchy. She understood the risk. The mistress was not the enemy. The system was. She could not dismantle it, but she could survive it, and so she studied. Every morning after Mass she read. Officially, she read scripture. In truth, she read law, history, poetry. She asked her chaplain for copies of Roman legal texts. She read about other queens, some strong, some tragic, some vanished into footnotes. She learned what not to do. She also wrote never letters. Those were watched, but prayers. Carefully constructed, layered with meanings only she understood. She wrote of light, but meant strategy. She wrote of silence, but meant resistance. She wrote of the will of God, but meant her own, and always she smiled. The court loved her. At least they said they did. She was elegant. She was pious. She gave generously to the poor. She held the Queen's procession with grace. She never embarrassed the court, but when she walked through the halls, courtiers fell silent too quickly. When she looked someone in the eyes too long, they looked away. She was becoming what they had not expected, aware, and that frightened them. There were rumors that she practiced astrology, that she read books in languages forbidden to women, that she once struck a maid in anger, that she cried alone at night. None were true, or perhaps some were. It didn't matter, because her image was already no longer hers. It belonged to the people. When the plague came, she was expected to lead the procession of prayer. When a neighboring duke threatened war, she was expected to speak to his wife. When the palace roof caved in from a winter storm, she was expected to visit the injured, even if it meant walking through freezing mud in satin shoes. She never complained, and she never stopped watching. She was 18 when the first real test came. A scandal in the treasury. The steward fled. The king was away on campaign. The court panicked. She convened the council herself. No one stopped her. She sat at the head of the table, the crown on her brow, the sunlight sharp against the stone walls. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She asked questions. She listened. And then she made decisions. 3 nobles were stripped of land. 2 merchants fined. The remaining funds redirected to the cathedral hospital. When the king returned, the matter was resolved. He said nothing. But from that day forward, he never interrupted her again. She did not become powerful overnight. But in the corners, in the quiet, in the margins, they began to take her seriously. Some feared her, some adored her, most misunderstood her, but she endured, because that was what queens were made to do. And in the next part, we'll follow her into the long years of ruling, not with glory, but with calculation, and what it meant to grow old in a world that only valued youth, beauty, and obedience. Time passed quietly in the palace. Seasons shifted like the tide. The same stone walls that echoed with coronation hymns now sighed with the weariness of a woman who had lived too long under their weight. The same doors she had once walked through, as a bride now creaked under her touch. She was still queen, but not the kind they celebrated. She was no longer young. Her hair, once described in songs and sermons and flowery poems by nervous suitors, had dulled with streaks of silver. Her skin, once powdered to perfection, now showed the fine map of age, lines, soft shadows beneath the eyes, the crease of time resting at the corners of her mouth. but it was her silence that had grown heavier. Not the silence of inexperience, or the fear of saying too much, but the silence of having said everything once and watched it ignored, the silence of knowing too much to speak freely, the silence of being watched with politeness but rarely heard. She was now the quiet center of the court, still present, still honored, still bowed to, but no longer the storm that shaped the tide. She had survived 3 pregnancies, 2 sons, 1 daughter. The daughter was married to a northern prince. She rarely wrote. The younger son had died of fever, despite all the prayers and relics and medicines. The elder, now king-in-waiting, was strong-willed, fond of music, dismissive of advice. He had once called her too cautious. She had said nothing in reply. By now she had learned which battles were worth the wound. In the early years, she had been called to every chamber, every negotiation, every corridor of power. Now she was consulted less, not openly dismissed, but gently edged aside like an heirloom too fragile to carry, but too respected to throw away. She spent her days in her solar now, a warm chamber facing the eastern gardens, lined with books, with heavy curtains that filtered the sun in quiet gold. She embroidered still, but no longer for display. Her patterns had changed. They were darker now. She stitched forests instead of roses, moons instead of lilies, wolves instead of lambs. No one asked her why. She often watched the courtiers from her balcony. The younger ladies walking in gowns too light for the season, hoping to be noticed. The noblemen laughing too loudly. The foreign ambassadors pretending not to stare. It was a play she had seen too many times. The costumes changed. The actors changed, but the script never did. She remembered when she had been the new queen. When every glance felt like a test, every word measured, every smile a weapon, and she remembered how many nights she had pressed her forehead against the cold glass, wondering how long she could carry the weight. Now she carried it with ease, but not without pain. She still attended Mass daily, still sat beside the king, though he had grown grey and stiff and more bitter than she remembered. They no longer spoke much. Their conversations were functional. She arranged the gifts for foreign visitors. He approved military movements. They were rulers, not lovers. Perhaps they had never been. The court no longer expected them to pretend. Still there were moments, quiet moments, moments when the firelight caught his face at just the right angle, and she remembered the boy he had been, the man who had once handed her a poem with trembling fingers, the prince who had once asked her, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral, if she was afraid. Yes, she had whispered. But I will not run. She had kept her promise. She had stayed, and in doing so she had shaped an empire, not with declarations but with presence, not with orders but with steadiness. Her name was on no battlefield, but it lived in the laws. She had revised the schools she had funded, the abbeys she had protected, the letters she had sent in secret. There were many who owed their lives to her. Most never knew it. She knew. And that was enough. Her grandchildren came rarely. Too far, too busy, too tangled in the affairs of court. They bowed, kissed her hand, offered gifts chosen by their governesses. One of them brought her a book bound in red leather. She pretended to admire the cover, though she had already read it years ago. Still she smiled, and when they left she added it to her shelf, between a collection of psalms and a treatise on ancient law. The walls of her chamber were lined with memories, not portraits, not tapestries, but letters, letters from queens of other lands, from abbesses, from young noblewomen once sent to court with trembling hearts, who had written her years later to say, "You looked at me, and I didn't feel invisible." That was what she had given them, not a new world, not freedom, but recognition. And that, in the brutal life of royal women, was sometimes the rarest gift of all. The court changed, new faces arrived, old ones left. The king's health faded. The younger courtiers began to speak more openly when she entered the room, not with disrespect, but with forgetfulness. They assumed she no longer mattered. That was their first mistake. She listened, and she remembered. When tensions rose with a rival kingdom, she recalled a treaty clause written 20 years prior, buried in the fine print of a forgotten scroll. When famine threatened the eastern provinces, she summoned a merchant whose loyalty she had secured with a kindness no one else had noticed. When the king finally fell ill, truly ill, beyond the reach of herbs or hope, it was she who held the court together. She arranged the vigil, she wrote the announcement, she sat at his bedside, not out of love, but duty, and something quieter, something like respect. He died in winter. The bells rang for 3 days, the kingdom entered mourning, and she, once again, became something else. The Queen Mother, the Dowager, the relic. But she was not gone. Not yet. Her son ascended. The throne with grace and noise and confidence. He wore the crown she had once worn, stood where she had once stood, looked into the faces of the same nobles who had bowed to her, and she watched, not bitter, not broken, just older and sharper than ever. She did not interfere, but when asked, she answered. And when not asked, she watched, because she knew what he did not yet know, that the court was not built on speeches, but on silences, not shaped by power, but by presence, not ruled by kings, but by those who outlived them. And in the next part, we will walk alongside her as the world forgets her name, but never her touch, and what it means to fade, not into history, but into legend. The rain came early that year. It soaked the rooftops before the sun could rise and ran down the lead gutters in slow, steady streams. The castle halls were damp for weeks, the stones sweating quietly, the tapestries curling at the corners from the wet. People moved more softly during the rain, candles burned longer in the mornings, windows stayed shut. In her chamber at the end of the east wing, the Queen Mother watched the mist roll across the gardens and didn't say a word. She no longer sat in court. She no longer received ambassadors. But her presence still lingered. Now, years after she'd been formally removed from council matters, every decision passed through her silence. If she looked away, the ministers hesitated. If she nodded once, the scribes took note. If she said nothing at all, they grew nervous, because she knew what they didn't. She remembered every name, every betrayal, every promise made under torchlight in the old chapel when the war had looked too close. Every noble child who had once played at her daughter's side, now seated at the council table with dangerous smiles and heavier crowns. She did not interrupt them. She did not scold. She waited. In the mornings she walked the long corridor past the old nursery. It was empty now. The painted walls had faded. One of the panels still held a faint sketch of a fox, drawn by her daughter decades ago, long before marriage took her across the sea. No one had painted over it. The servants said it was bad luck to erase what children had left behind. In her solar, the Queen Mother wrote letters, not the political kind. She wrote to women, widows, abbesses, forgotten cousins exiled to countryside. Manners Maidens she had once comforted at court, now grown and married to lords they did not choose. She wrote carefully, without pretense or decoration. The ink was brown from age, her fingers stiff with the cold, but her words still landed like quiet footsteps in deep snow, soft but unmissable. She signed each one, not as queen, not as mother, not as your grace, just as herself. Those who received her letters rarely spoke of them, but they were kept, folded into prayer books, tucked into sleeves, passed from hand to hand, because even now she remained a figure too large to name aloud, not feared, not loved, respected, and that was enough. On feast days she still dined in the great hall, but only when summoned. Her table was smaller now, tucked in the corner, not far from the fire. The new queen, her son's wife, sat in the center, draped. In silks, her laughter sweet but unsure, the queen mother never corrected her. She only observed. She remembered what it had felt like to be watched, to be measured, to be picked apart by eyes trained to spot weakness behind rouge and ribbon. She would not do that to another. Instead, she sent the young queen gifts, simple ones. A carved comb, a book of hours, a dried sprig of lavender from the old garden chapel. Nothing that spoke too loudly, just enough to say, "I see you. You are not alone." It was how women communicated when the world gave them no voice, in glances, in gestures, in tokens power passed like a breath. Her son visited once a week. He brought news, formal and clean, grain harvests, merchant troubles, shifts in alliances. He never stayed long. He was uncomfortable now, not cruel, just unsure what she was. A memory, walking, a piece of his childhood grown too large to name. She didn't mind. She had raised him to be a king, not a son. That was the cost. He ruled well enough, but he did not see the cracks she saw. The steward who bowed too low, the captain of the guard who drank more than he spoke, the lady-in-waiting whose eyes never left the new queen's goblet, the bishop who had started arriving late to council, with ink-stained hands and a nervous smile. She saw it all, and she waited. Because that was what old queens did. They did not rule. They remembered, and remembrance had its own weight. She dreamed often, now dreams not of battle or court or glory, but of gardens, warm hands, voices she'd not heard in decades, her sister's laughter, her daughter's lullaby, her husband's face, not the king he became, but the boy he once was, standing under an olive tree, asking if she liked poetry. She never answered. In the dream, but she always woke smiling. Her body ached more these days. Her hands curled in the mornings. Her knees stiffened when it rained. But she refused to be carried. She still walked to Mass, even if the altar now seemed twice as far. She still read by firelight, even if the pages blurred. She still wrote letters, even if the ink ran crooked. Because this was her castle. Not by name, but by breath. Every wall knew her steps. Every floor remembered her silence. Every tapestry had once been chosen by her hand. The fire grates still bore the mark of her father's house. The tower bells still rang on the hour because she had demanded consistency after. The old steward died in the famine year. She had shaped the rhythm of this place, and in time it would forget her. All castles forget eventually. They remember kings, wars, feasts. They do not remember the woman who stayed up through nights of childbirth, holding on to life with bloodied hands. They do not remember the letters she burned to protect allies. The child she buried quietly beneath the chapel floor because plague took him before he had a name. The gift she gave a servant girl once when the girl's father died and she had no coin to bury him. History is loud, but queens are often quiet, and quiet things vanish first. Still, she lingered. One more winter, one more spring. She walked the garden with a cane now, nodding to the trees she'd planted 50 years ago. The apricot tree bore fruit that year. The cook brought some to her chamber in a pewter bowl, chilled with fresh snow. She smiled and ate slowly, savoring each bite. It was almost time. She had no illness, no diagnosis, only a deep knowing. She began to sort her things, gave away her jewelry. Her rings went to the abbey, her books to the new queen, her embroidery to the chapel, her letters burned, not out of shame, but because they were hers, and some things a woman should carry to the grave. When the morning finally came, grey, cold, gentle, she did not cry. She simply sat in her chair by the fire, closed her eyes, and let the sound of rain on the windows take her. She was buried beneath the chapel. No statue, no crown, only a stone. Etched with a line she had once whispered to a frightened maid decades ago during a long, terrifying night of siege. A woman's strength is not in her voice. It is in how long she can hold silence. In the next and final part, we will walk not with queens, but through the legacy they left behind, buried not in history books, but in the memory of places, in the quiet traditions passed through hands, and in the echoes that still hum through cold castle stones. The castle stands still, long after the queens have gone, after the fires have burned out and the courtiers have vanished into names etched shallowly into brittle ledgers. The stone walls remain. They no longer echo with music. No feasts roar through the great hall. The air is colder now still, but if you walk quietly through the ruins carefully without disturbing the moss, you can still feel them. The royal women. Not in the portraits, for most of their faces were never painted. Not in the books, for their names were only recorded when they gave birth to sons or died young, but in the corners, in the dust. In the way the wind wraps itself around the edges of a window, no longer paned with glass, humming softly like a lullaby sung in a tongue, no longer spoken. This is where their memory lives, not in marble, but in the memory of place. A worn groove in the stone floor beneath the chapel's altar, formed not by a priest, but by a queen's knees during nightly prayers for a child who never came home as a shallow notch carved into the windowsill of the eastern solar, where a princess once etched lines with her ring as she watched snow fall and wondered if the man she was to marry would be kind. A tapestry half rotted in the vaulted hallway, its colors faded, but if you look close, just close enough, you'll see a figure in the background, a woman who doesn't belong to the story being told. Her eyes, stitched in fine silk, are not focused on the battle in the foreground. They're looking back at you. They say the past is quiet, but that's not true. It whispers constantly. In convent gardens where lavender still grows in the exact pattern planted by an abbess queen centuries ago, each row a message in the only language she was allowed to speak. In ancient kitchens where floor tiles don't match, because a queen once had them replaced, just in front of the hearth, after a scullery maid slipped and broke her leg and no one noticed, except her. In a narrow staircase that leads nowhere, sealed shut for hundreds of years because it once led to a room that held something someone thought should be forgotten. But stone never forgets, and neither do women. Even in a world that asked them to remain quiet, small and still, women remembered, and they passed that memory on. Not always with words, not in songs, but in the way they moved, in the way they stood when facing power. in the way they tucked letters into hems, in the way they bent the rules without ever breaking them, because they knew what would happen if they were caught. They survived by becoming invisible, and in doing so, they made sure that parts of themselves would never be erased. There are countless stories no one will ever read. The girl who taught herself to write by candlelight, copying psalms into the margins of laundry lists. The woman who nursed her rival's child in secret because the queen had been too weak to feed him. The dowager who used her final breath to dictate one last letter, meant not for court or legacy, but for a servant who once saved her from falling down a staircase in a moment no one saw. No one recorded those moments, but they happened. And history, loud, harsh, obsessed with kings and battles and borders, missed them, because history does not reward silence. It does not know how to listen, but if you listen differently, if you sit with the quiet long enough, you will find them. You will find the queen, who braided her daughter's hair before sending her away to be married at 14, whispering advice between the strands, because she wasn't allowed to speak freely at court. You will find the nun who once ruled a duchy through letters, her seal mistaken for her brother's, her orders obeyed without question, her name struck from the records when they discovered she was a woman. You will find the princess who locked herself in the castle library for a week after her brother was crowned, refusing to come out until he swore he would not sell her off to the man who had already buried 2 wives. And you will find the old queen, no longer young, no longer feared, kneeling beside a small grave marked only with a wild rose bush, her crown left at the foot of the stone, her voice finally her own. They were there, and they shaped the world more than anyone will ever admit, because while kings made laws, queens made customs, and customs survive, they lived in the prayers whispered over swaddling cloths, in the feast day, rituals chosen by queens who insisted on feeding the poor, in the education of noble daughters who were taught to read not for their husbands, but for themselves, in the color of robes, the names of cities, the traditions of mourning, all chosen by women who were told their only purpose was obedience. They were told to be beautiful, they chose to be enduring, they were told to be silent, they chose to remember, they were told to bear sons, they bore nations, and when the world moved on without them, they left behind small things that outlived crowns. A song hummed by grandmothers centuries later with no memory of its origin, a particular way of binding hair, copied unknowingly from the court of a forgotten duchess, a flower, planted beside the castle gate, still blooming every spring, long after the castle itself has fallen. So when you walk through the ruins, real or imagined, walk slowly, step softly, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because this is not the place of kings. It never was. It was theirs, and they are still here. In the breath of the wind that curls through broken windows, in the quiet sigh of old stone, in the hush of sleep, when history finally grows tired of shouting, and the night opens its arms to stories no one ever thought to write down. You don't need to remember every name. Just remember they were here, that they lived, that they endured. That silence, when held long enough, becomes a kind of monument, unseen but eternal. Good night.